In this lecture, we are going to consider the issue of Chinese and Asian immigration to the United States, primarily in the 19th but also the early 20th century. It is not a happy chapter in American history, but it was also important because the United States Supreme Court established its most important precedents with respect to immigration law during this era. As we will talk about in the next several lectures, that power that the Supreme Court has said that Congress has, the plenary power, is a very important doctrine that dates back to this period. So the topic today, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States Supreme Court. In our last lecture, we looked at Ellis Island and had a short film about some of the conditions there. If we compare West Coast immigration, we need to look at the Angel Island Detention Center, and it's quite a contrast to Ellis Island. I would like for you to view a few excerpts from a documentary known as Carved in Silence. It's an excellent resource for history of the treatment of Chinese at Angel Island in California.
After crossing the Pacific Ocean, Chinese immigrants faced the most difficult part of their long journey. The last mile, the distance separating Angel Island from San Francisco, from America. The immigrants could not know if they would leave the island in 2 days or 2 years. Their ordeal included a rigorous physical examination. But the most intimidating experience was a series of exhaustive interrogations conducted by immigration inspectors. The immigrants' performance in these interrogations would determine their fate.
What is your name?
How many windows are there in your house?
Where are the kitchens?
Which is your parents' room?
Have you any tablets in your house?
Have you any idols in your house?
How many feet is your house from the house next door? What is your name? Have you any idols in your house? Your father's name?
Have you any tablets?
How many windows are there in your house?
Have you any idols?
When did your father come?
China in those years had no record of births, marriages, deaths. If they did, they were not available to the people. And that fact that you couldn't go back to a vital statistics record to determine whether one person was related to another, and of course the existing poverty in China, which would understandably impel any father to want to get his son out of there one way or another to a better place to live, that brought about this system of comparing notes to see if you were convinced that they had actually lived together in China.
Waiting took up most of the time. Waiting to be examined, waiting to be interrogated again and again, waiting in fear and frustration, knowing that even the smallest mistake could destroy the dream of America. Worst of all, waiting with uncertainty. As one detainee said, "At least in prison, you know when you will get out."
This is the voice of America, one of the United Nations. And today, President Roosevelt has just asked Congress to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act, which keeps Chinese nationals from emigrating to the United States. The President said repeal of the act would correct a historic mistake and would be further proof of the friendship of the United States for China.
On December 17, 1943, Congress voted to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws. The repeal was strictly a political decision, motivated by America's alliance with China in the war against Japan. But even as allies, only a token 105 Chinese were allowed to enter the United States each year. The quota for England, another ally, was 66,000. However, with repeal came citizenship. Chinese immigrants were finally given the right to become naturalized citizens. They could vote, serve on juries, and qualify for government jobs. They could participate fully in the social, political, and economic life of their adopted country. Finally, they could begin to live as Americans.
The full film is available as a link on this website should you wish to see it in its entirety. Before we discuss the Chinese Exclusion Act and the important Supreme Court decision that followed, let's take a look at some of the history of Chinese immigration in the western United States. As you can see from this image, the Chinese served in many capacities, but the most important may have been as manual laborers in building the Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese immigration in the 19th century followed the gold rush, but as the 19th century grew to a close, labor organizations thought that the Chinese provided too much competition and for other racial reasons advocated excluding Chinese altogether from citizenship and limiting the numbers of Chinese that might immigrate into the United States. The result was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This image shows an advertisement in a newspaper after the passage of the act. And you can see that it's exultory, Chinese excluded. The Democratic Chinese Exclusion Bill has been signed by our Democratic president. And note at the bottom, the white man is on top. This episode has been shameful for the United States for some time. You can see in this political cartoon, political editorial, that the American exclusion of the Chinese was a skeleton in the closet for the United States when the United States in the World War II era protested against Russian exclusion of Jewish Americans. Continuing with political commentary, the opposition to Chinese in the West was not shared by all of those in the East. This political cartoon introduces the Chinese question. It shows Lady Liberty protecting a Chinese person against a crowd. And among the signs that it shows, a union meeting against the importation of what were called there Chinese barbarians. I'd like for us to look at one more political cartoon from the late 19th century. This is Let the Chinese Embrace Civilization and They May Stay. If you look at the various pictures here, you can see for the U.S. Senate, for example, talk, 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 talk. There is an embrace of alcohol. There's voting. If the argument was that Chinese should be excluded because they could not assimilate into American culture, this is clearly satire on American culture. In terms of how subsequent acts, collectively known as the Chinese Exclusion Acts, worked, they did permit some immigration for Chinese, some immediate family members of merchants, for example. Here's a document that would be necessary for immigration and would prove one's status. It's an affidavit entered at the state of New York. It indicates that a 39-year-old man was a merchant, and it attests to his employment in New York. Notice the last paragraph. I make this affidavit in order to prove my status as a merchant and thus enable my son, age 15 years, whose photograph is attached hereto, to enter the United States, where I will undertake his care and support. So it was necessary, in light of the Chinese Exclusion Act, to bring in an immediate family member in this fashion. I would like to turn now to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in what is known as the Chinese Exclusion Case in 1889. Let's talk about some of the important facts of this case. A Chinese national known as Li Ping possessed what was known as a certificate of re-entry into the United States. He had lived in the United States for 12 years. He had gone home to visit family and sought to return to the United States. He was refused admission at the port of entry, San Francisco, even though when he left, he had a legal right to re-enter. Hence, he had obtained a certificate of re-entry that promised he could return. However, Congress changed its mind and changed the law. They did so 1 week before Mr. Ping attempted to re-enter the United States. And in fact, he was already at sea on his way to the United States when Congress took this action. So Mr. Ping arrives, he has a certificate of re-entry from the United States government, and he's refused admission. The lawsuit followed and ultimately made its way to the United States Supreme Court, where Mr. Ping lost. This was the first case to develop what was known as the plenary power doctrine, that Congress, without much oversight from the courts, can decide when and where and under what conditions immigration can take place. They can exclude an entire race, and they can go back on promises such as that given to Mr. Ping. Let's look at some of the language. The majority opinion was written by Justice Field. If Congress, quote, considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country who will not assimilate with us to be dangerous to its peace and security, its determination is conclusive upon the judiciary. In other words, the Supreme Court would not review that decision, and Congress's power in this area did not violate any provision of the United States Constitution. I have made available portions of the text of this decision as well as from the dissent, which I would like for you to read because we were going to be discussing in the next lecture some of its most important tenets. This is just an amusing illustration that I wanted to show. It is a cartoon of the Supreme Court at about the same time that the Chinese Exclusion Act cases were settled, so I will not try to identify the particular Supreme Court justices that are represented here, but you can see that this is not a particularly flattering view of the court. So to wrap up this lecture, I want us to think about the following from the Chinese exclusion case, especially as you read through the material. Understanding the plenary power doctrine is key to understanding much of modern constitutional law. Ask these questions. Try to answer these questions, or at least begin thinking about them prior to our next lecture. What is the source of the federal immigration power? Where is this power vested? What is the role of judicial review? These questions and more will be the subject of our next lecture.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.